It was the first time in my life that I had felt truly invisible. I had always been a part of the family, an integral member, someone whose presence was always known, whose absence would always be noted. But last Thanksgiving was different. That's when it started. The day began like any other Thanksgiving. The smell of roasting turkey and cinnamon rolls filled the air. Mom and Dad argued over the stuffing recipe in the kitchen, while my older brother Andrew and younger sister Lily fought over who got to set the table. Grandma sat in her usual spot in the corner of the living room, her glasses perched precariously on the tip of her nose as she stared out the window. I had just come back home after a few months away at college, looking forward to reconnecting with my family. We didn't always get along, but holidays like Thanksgiving had always been the one time when everything felt right again. The chaos of dinner preparations, the chatter, the laughter, it was like the glue that held us together. At least, it used to be. But something was different this time. I could feel it in my bones, that uncomfortable, suffocating feeling that something was wrong. I pushed it aside at first, thinking I was just overthinking things. After all, it had been a while since I'd been back, and maybe the dynamics had shifted while I was gone. But as the day wore on, I realized something terrifying. My family was pretending I didn't exist. It started with small things. At breakfast, I asked my dad to pass the butter, but he didn't even glance up. He simply handed it to Andrew, who sat next to him, without a word. I thought it was just an oversight at first, but then it happened again and again. Every time I spoke, it was as though my voice simply disappeared into the air. Lily, my younger sister, stood up to fetch something from the pantry. She brushed past me without acknowledging me, like I was nothing more than a piece of furniture in the room. I caught her eyes for a split second, but she quickly looked away, as though she hadn't seen me at all. I tried to shake it off, thinking it was some sort of bizarre misunderstanding, but then the strangest thing happened. I went to grab a glass of water from the counter, and as I reached for it, I felt a cold chill sweep over me. The room seemed to darken, the air thickening with an oppressive weight. My hands trembled as I picked up the glass, but when I turned to face the family, I froze in shock. They were all looking at the television. Grandma, with her old hands curled around her cane, was watching the screen intently, but her eyes didn't seem to focus on anything. Andrew was absorbed in his phone, tapping away at the screen as though I wasn't even standing there. Mom and Dad were sitting side by side, discussing the guest list for the upcoming Christmas dinner. They spoke as if they didn't even see me. I cleared my throat, trying again. "Hey, can someone pass me the mashed potatoes?" No response. I glanced around the room, my heartbeat quickening. They were all pretending. I could feel the weight of their avoidance bearing down on me, suffocating me. The more I spoke, the more invisible I became. It wasn't long before I became certain that this wasn't some strange misunderstanding. It wasn't a coincidence. My family was ignoring me on purpose. By the time dinner came around, the atmosphere had become unnervingly silent. No one spoke to me, no one even looked at me. I sat at the table, feeling the cold weight of their collective disregard, the hollow emptiness growing within me. "Is anyone going to say anything?" I asked aloud, my voice thick with a mix of confusion and fear. Mom glanced at me, but there was no recognition in her eyes, no warmth. She just continued to pass the potatoes to Andrew, who didn't even acknowledge my question. It was as if I wasn't there at all. I looked to Dad for help, but his expression was vacant. He was staring at his plate, chewing silently. I felt a pang of desperation in my chest. "Mom, Dad," I whispered, my voice barely audible now. "What's going on? Why is everyone ignoring me?" But it was like I had never spoken. It felt like I had stepped into some alternate reality, a version of Thanksgiving where I was not part of the family, not even a ghost. They didn't acknowledge my presence at all. Later that night, as the house grew quieter and the last remnants of dinner were cleaned up, I went to my old bedroom, hoping that some time alone would help me figure out what was happening. But when I stepped inside, I was struck by a deep sense of unease. The room was exactly as I had left it, except for one thing. My name, Sarah, was scratched out on the door. I stared at it in horror. I could still see the faint traces of where the letters had been, remnants of a name that had once been mine. I ran my fingers over the scratches, the rough edges catching on my skin, but the feeling of dread only grew stronger. That's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned, heart pounding in my chest, but no one was there. As the night dragged on, I tried to piece together what had happened. I replayed every conversation, every look, every moment where I had felt dismissed or ignored. And then it hit me, my family had erased me, not just from the dinner table, but from their lives entirely. I wasn't sure what had caused it. Was it something I had done, or was it something much darker, something more sinister, creeping its way through the cracks of our family? The truth I would soon discover was far more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The air in my room felt thick, almost oppressive, as if it was closing in around me. I sat on the edge of my bed, my mind racing, but every attempt to make sense of the situation only made the dread grow heavier. The family I knew, the ones who had always been there for me, had turned into strangers. It wasn't just that they were ignoring me, it was as if they had forgotten I even existed. I ran my hands through my hair, trying to steady my breathing. I needed to figure this out. I couldn't just sit in my room wondering if I was losing my mind. I glanced back at the door, where my name had once been. I thought about the deep scratches that marred it now. It wasn't just an idle mark or some childish prank. Whoever or whatever had done this meant to erase me, to remove me from the very fabric of this house. My head throbbed, and I stood up, determined to confront my family. I had to get some answers, even if it meant dragging them into the truth, kicking and screaming. If they weren't going to speak to me on their own, I would force them to acknowledge me. I left my room and stepped into the hallway. The house, once full of the sounds of familial warmth, laughter, footsteps, the clinking of plates, was eerily silent. The air felt colder now, like a weight pressing down on me with each step I took. I walked toward the living room, where I'd last seen my family. The dim light from the fireplace cast long shadows across the room. They were all there, sitting exactly as they had been earlier, but they didn't even look up as I entered. Mom was in the armchair, Dad in his usual spot on the couch, and Andrew was sprawled across the floor with his phone in hand. Lily sat at the corner, her eyes glued to the TV screen. No one acknowledged my presence. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice trembling as I spoke the words aloud for the first time. What did I do to deserve this? No response. I moved closer, my hands shaking with a mix of fear and frustration. I reached for Andrew's shoulder, hoping for some kind of reaction, anything. But when my hand made contact, there was nothing. No flinch, no shift, not even a glance. It was as though I had touched the air itself, a mere breeze passing by him. My pulse quickened. "Andrew." I took a step back, heart pounding. My breath came in short, panicked gasps. Something was happening to me, something I didn't understand. It wasn't just that they were ignoring me, it was as if they couldn't see me at all. I ran my fingers through my hair, my mind spiraling. Was I going crazy? I had to be. My family wouldn't just disappear me, not like this. Suddenly, I heard the faintest sound, a soft scraping noise, like nails on wood. It came from the hallway behind me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Slowly, I turned around, but there was nothing there. But then I saw it. The door to the basement. It was slightly ajar, a crack of darkness peeking through the gap, almost beckoning me in. I didn't remember leaving it open. No one had been down there since last year, when we'd gone to retrieve the Christmas decorations. My chest tightened at the thought. I had always avoided the basement. There were strange things down there, things I didn't fully understand. But the scratching, that sound, was coming from there. Without thinking, I found myself walking toward the stairs, the cold air of the house pressing against me. Each step down into the darkness felt heavier than the last. It wasn't just the silence of the house that was suffocating me, it was the emptiness, the feeling that I had become nothing. And this basement, this place, might hold the key to understanding why. I reached the bottom of the stairs and stood in the dark, trying to adjust my eyes. The faintest slivers of moonlight crept through a high window, casting eerie shadows on the stone floor. I moved slowly through the space, my breath shallow and uneven. The air smelled damp, musty, and something else, something old, a twinge of something familiar and yet foreign. And then in the far corner, I saw it. A chair, a wooden chair, old and weathered, sitting in the center of the room. It wasn't just any chair, it was the same one I'd seen my dad use in the living room years ago when he would tell us stories by the fire. The chair was wrong. It had the same worn finish, but now the wood was scarred, the legs uneven, and the seat had strange, circular grooves etched into it. The scratching noise came again, louder this time, as though someone was tapping their fingers on the back of the chair. I took a step forward, my heart thudding painfully against my ribs. As I neared the chair, my eyes widened in horror. There, in the seat, was a figure. But it wasn't human. It was a blur, a distortion, an absence, as though someone or something was trying to take shape but couldn't quite manage it. It flickered like a glitch in a video, a presence that was there and yet not. My throat constricted, and for a moment, I thought I might choke on the fear that rushed up from the pit of my stomach. "Who?" I whispered, barely able to form the words. The figure tilted its head slowly, and a voice echoed in my mind, a whisper that wasn't spoken, but felt. "You don't belong here. You never did." I stumbled back, but the figure's gaze, if it could even be called that, followed me, locking onto me with an unnatural intensity. The air around me grew colder, and the walls seemed to press in. It wasn't just the basement anymore. It was the house, the whole house, closing in on me. The whispering grew louder. "You are not part of this family. You were never meant to be." I turned and ran back toward the stairs, my heart in my throat, but as I reached the bottom step, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening crash. I tried to pull at the knob, but it was locked. I pounded against the door, screaming for someone, anyone to hear me, but there was nothing, no sound, no response. And then I heard it. The door behind me, the basement door, creaked open. I turned slowly, but it wasn't the figure. It was my family. Mom, Dad, Andrew, Lily. They stood in the doorway, their faces pale and blank. Not angry, not sad, just empty. And they all spoke in unison, their voices hollow and distant. "You don't belong here, Sarah. You never did." I didn't know how much time had passed. Seconds, minutes, hours. My mind was a blur, spinning in an endless loop of confusion and fear. My family stood there in the doorway, motionless, their blank eyes staring through me as if I were a ghost. "You don't belong here, Sarah. You never did." The words echoed in my mind, relentless, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. My throat tightened, and for the first time, I wondered if I might never be able to escape the suffocating grip of whatever had taken hold of my family. Was this my punishment? Was I being erased, or was there something more? Something far darker at play. I stumbled back from them, my legs shaking beneath me. The door behind me was locked, and the room seemed to close in, the walls pressing tighter, colder, until I could barely breathe. But as I looked at my family, a thought began to form, one that terrified me. What if they weren't my family anymore? What if they had never been? "Mom, Dad," my voice cracked, and I could feel the desperation in every syllable. I wasn't sure if I was trying to wake them up, or if I was pleading with myself to believe that they hadn't truly abandoned me. There was no response. They just stood there, their eyes empty, their faces unreadable. It was as if they were puppets, controlled by some unseen hand. But who, or what, was pulling the strings? My breath came faster, and I stepped backward, hitting the cold concrete wall of the basement. The temperature had dropped drastically, and now I could feel the chill seeping into my very bones. I ran my hand over my face, trying to steady myself. That's when I noticed it. A small glimmer of light flickered in the corner of the room, near the far wall. It wasn't the faint light from the basement window. This was something else. It was a dull glow, pale and unnatural, as though something was pulsing beneath the surface of the stone wall. My heart skipped a beat. Slowly, I walked toward the glow, my feet dragging against the cold floor. The closer I got, the more intense the sensation became. It was like a pressure in my chest, as though the glow was calling to me, no, demanding my attention. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and pressed my palm against the stone. The wall rippled. For a split second, I thought I was imagining it, but then it happened again. The stone shifted, as though it were breathing, expanding and contracting with each pulse of light. I gasped, my pulse quickening. I stepped back, almost falling over, but then I heard it. A voice. Not from my family, this voice was something else, something far older, far colder. It whispered from the depths of the wall, a voice that was at once familiar and alien, as though it was speaking both to me and through me. Sarah. I froze, my blood running cold. It was my name, but it wasn't my family's voice. It was something else, something that had always been here, buried beneath the house. You were never meant to return. You never should have come back. I stepped forward, despite the terror clawing at my chest. The wall was no longer solid. It was a shifting mass, like liquid stone, folding and moving beneath my fingers. I pressed harder, trying to understand, and then, with a horrifying lurch, the wall cracked open. Behind it lay a dark passageway, narrow and winding, stretching into the unknown. The glow from within was faint but steady, casting strange shadows that danced and flickered along the walls. I felt as though something was pulling me in, drawing me toward the darkness. A sound echoed from the passageway, a low, throaty chuckle. It wasn't human. Without thinking, I stepped into the narrow hallway. The air inside felt colder, the pressure around me increasing as I moved forward. The walls seemed to pulse with an ancient rhythm, like the heartbeat of something long forgotten, something that should never have been disturbed. As I moved deeper into the tunnel, I could hear whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs that grew louder with each step I took. The air tasted stale, and the oppressive weight of the darkness threatened to suffocate me, but I couldn't stop now, not when the truth was so close, not when I could almost feel it. The reason why my family had turned on me, why they had forgotten me. The tunnel opened into a small chamber, barely larger than a closet. At the center of the room was a pedestal, carved with intricate symbols that twisted and shifted, like they were alive. Resting on the pedestal was a book, its cover worn and ancient, pages yellowed with age. The same cold light emanated from it, flickering like the pulse of a dying star. I hesitated, but something inside me urged me forward. I needed to know. I needed to understand why I was here, why my family had turned against me. I reached out and opened the book. The pages were filled with strange, cryptic text, written in a language I couldn't understand. The ink seemed to shift as my eyes scanned the pages, the words rearranging themselves as if the book was alive and reacting to me. I ran my fingers over the symbols, feeling an odd warmth radiate from the pages, and then one word stood out to me, glowing faintly on the page. Inheritance. My heart skipped. Inheritance. But I wasn't supposed to inherit anything. I wasn't the firstborn. I wasn't special in any way. Why would this word be so important? The book seemed to hum in my hands, and then the whispering grew louder, more insistent, more desperate. You shouldn't have opened it. You shouldn't have seen it. The walls around me began to shift and tremble, and I heard footsteps echoing from behind me. It was my family. No, not my family. They were different. Their footsteps were too slow, too deliberate. Their presence wasn't human anymore. You should have stayed away, a voice whispered from the shadows, one I didn't recognize. Now you've awakened what should have stayed buried. I turned, and standing in the doorway of the chamber was my father, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. But there was something else there, something empty, something wrong. He stepped forward, his voice low and raspy. You found it. Now you must become a part of it. Before I could react, the walls of the chamber began to close in, the ground trembling beneath my feet. The book flared with a blinding light, and I could hear my father's voice, distorted and hollow, saying one final thing before the darkness overtook me. You never existed. Not in this world. Not anymore. The light from the book was blinding. I tried to close my eyes, but it burned into my vision, searing everything around me in a kaleidoscope of white. The walls seemed to press in, the air thick and suffocating, and I could hear the faint sound of my heartbeat, quickening, drumming in my ears like a warning. But nothing prepared me for what happened next. I felt the ground beneath me shift, no, lurch. It wasn't just the house trembling. The entire foundation of the building seemed to convulse, as if the house itself was waking up. The floor beneath my feet cracked, sending jagged fissures spiderwebbing out in every direction. I stumbled, trying to catch myself, but the ground was no longer solid. The walls distorted, bending unnaturally as the space around me grew more unstable, more alien. Sarah, it's too late. My father's voice echoed from behind me, deeper and colder than I had ever heard it before. I spun around to find him standing at the threshold of the chamber, his eyes wide, his mouth slightly open as if in a trance. His face was ashen, his features more skeletal than they should have been. I tried to speak, to cry out, but no sound came from my lips. It was as though my voice had been stolen. My father stepped forward, his movements slow, deliberate, like he was caught in some inescapable pull, some magnetic force. He raised his hand, and in his palm, a symbol was burned into his skin, an intricate, twisted design that pulsed with the same eerie glow as the book. I wanted to run, but the walls were closing in, the passage narrowing like a tunnel collapsing in on itself. The book's glow intensified, and the whispers in the room grew louder, a chorus of voices that sounded both familiar and foreign. You shouldn't have seen it. You were never supposed to know. I tried to back away, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like stone, my body paralyzed by the weight of the voices, the oppressive air, the very presence of something ancient and malevolent. The more I struggled, the tighter the grip became. My father's voice broke through the chaos, thin and broken. "I'm sorry, Sarah. You should never have come back. You were never meant to be part of this." "Part of what?" I managed to force the words out, my throat raw. "What is this?" But my father didn't answer. Instead, his eyes went glassy, distant, and the words came not from his mouth, but from the air around me. A voice far older, far more sinister, reverberated through the room, as though the house itself was speaking. "The inheritance has been passed down through generations. You were never meant to question it. You were never meant to return." I looked around, trying to understand, but the room had begun to warp again. The walls stretched and contorted like something alive. The book on the pedestal pulsed faster, its pages flipping wildly, and with each turn, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Stop it," I screamed, my voice finally breaking free from the paralysis, though I didn't know if I was even speaking aloud, or if the words were just a frantic thought in my mind. But the room was already responding. The shadows in the corners of the chamber thickened, and the temperature dropped. I could see my breath in front of me now, swirling in the frigid air. The whispers began to form into words, and they were clear now, unmistakable. "You were never meant to return to this place, Sarah. This is not your home. This is not your family. You do not belong here." I turned to look at my father, but he was no longer standing in the doorway. His body was still there, but it was somehow wrong. His eyes were wide open, but there was nothing behind them, only emptiness. His lips moved, but the voice that came out of his mouth wasn't his own. It was a growl, a guttural sound, like the growl of something buried deep beneath the earth. "You belong to us now." I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. The room was closing in, and the voices from the walls grew louder still, deafening, overwhelming. The glow from the book was blinding, the light a stark, unnatural white that made everything around me seem to fade into shadow. My father's form flickered, his body dissolving into the light. "You are ours. You have always been ours." The floor cracked beneath me, and I fell to my knees, the force of the words shoving me into the ground. I gasped for air, my chest tight, the darkness pressing against my skin. I tried to push myself up, but it was like the very air itself had turned against me. I felt trapped, as though the house had swallowed me whole. And then, through the chaos, I heard something else, a voice, familiar but faint, a whisper just at the edge of my consciousness. "Sarah." I turned, my heart leaping in my chest. My name, that voice. It was my voice, the real one, but where was it coming from? Suddenly, the pressure in the room lifted, and the swirling darkness seemed to freeze for a moment. Everything went still. The walls stopped shifting. The voices fell silent. And standing in the corner of the chamber, half hidden in shadow, was me. I froze. The figure before me was identical to me, every detail, every feature, even down to the way I stood. But there was something wrong about her. Her eyes were empty, hollow like my father's, and her smile was twisted, predatory. The air around her seemed to shimmer with an unnatural energy, as though she wasn't quite part of this world. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice like a rasping wind. "You've come home." My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled back. This couldn't be happening. This thing wasn't me. It couldn't be. But as I stared into its eyes, I felt an overwhelming sense of recognition. This wasn't some distant creature. It was a part of me, something I had left behind, something that had been buried deep inside my own soul for far too long. I am you, and you are me. The figure stepped forward, her movements smooth, predatory. Do you understand now why you were never meant to return? Why they erased you? Her voice was low, mocking. They know what you are, and they know what you'll become. I backed away, my legs shaky, my mind reeling. No, I'm not. I'm not you. I'm me. I'm Sarah. The figure laughed and the sound echoed around the room, filling every corner. You are nothing but a shadow of what was meant to be, a failure, and now it's time to finish what was started. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My body felt frozen, rooted to the ground, as if someone was holding me there. The book began to glow brighter, and the whispers returned, louder, more frantic. The walls groaned as though they were alive, and I could hear the faint sound of something shifting, scraping against the stone. A force, something dark, ancient, and powerful, was drawing closer. It was rising. It was coming for me. You are no longer Sarah. You are part of us now. The last thing I heard before everything went dark was the sound of my own voice, echoing in the distance, a cold, hollow whisper. You were never meant to return. I didn't know how long I was unconscious. The darkness around me was absolute, suffocating, and when I came to, I couldn't tell if I was still in the chamber beneath the house or if I had been dragged somewhere else entirely. My head ached, my body was sore, and there was a ringing in my ears that refused to stop. For a moment, I just lay there, trying to gather my thoughts. Everything was blurry, the air thick with an unfamiliar heaviness. It took me a while to realize I was lying on the cold, damp floor of a stone room. The walls were smooth, slick with moisture, and the oppressive silence was deafening. I blinked several times, trying to clear the fog from my mind. As my eyes adjusted, I could make out the faint outline of something in front of me, a shadow, and then I recognized it. It was the figure, my figure, the twisted, hollow version of myself that I had seen in the chamber below. She was standing by the far wall, watching me, her eyes wide and empty, a twisted grin stretched across her face. I knew you would wake up, she said, her voice echoing in the stillness, cold and eerie. You always do. I tried to push myself up, but my body felt too heavy, as though I were being weighed down by some invisible force. I gritted my teeth, summoning every ounce of strength I had to sit up. Who are you? I rasped, the words coming out in a broken whisper. She stepped closer, her footsteps silent on the stone floor. I am you, Sarah, she said, her voice dripping with malice. The part of you that's always been here, the part of you that they tried to bury. My heart hammered in my chest. The way she spoke, the way she looked at me, it was like staring into a mirror, only the reflection was corrupted, deformed. No, you're not me, I said, struggling to push the words out. You're not me. She laughed, and the sound chilled me to the bone. You've always been me. They just tricked you into thinking you were someone else. Your whole life, your entire existence, they've lied to you. Her smile widened, and she leaned in close, her breath cold against my skin. And now, it's time for you to remember. A sudden, sharp pain shot through my head and I gasped. The world around me spun, and memories that I didn't recognize began to flood my mind. Flashes of images, feelings, emotions. My family, my real family, none of it felt familiar. The memories were wrong, distorted. They didn't fit. I saw my mother, her face twisted in agony, her eyes hollow and lifeless. My father, his hands shaking, a look of fear in his eyes as he turned away from me. My brother, his smile stretching too wide, too cruel, his laughter echoing in the darkness. No, I whispered, shaking my head, trying to push the memories away, but they kept coming, relentless, overwhelming. This isn't real. This isn't me. The figure before me tilted her head, her grin widening. You were never meant to remember, but now you have no choice. Suddenly, I felt the ground beneath me shift. The walls groaned, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow longer, stretching toward me like tendrils of darkness. The air turned heavy, thick with the scent of something decayed, something ancient, and then I heard it. A voice, distant but growing louder, resonating from all around me, vibrating in my bones. It was a voice that I had heard before, the voice of the thing that had been manipulating everything. Sarah. I looked around frantically, but there was no one there. The voice came again, this time clearer, more insistent. You are part of the inheritance now. There is no going back. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing tighter and tighter, as if the very house was alive, breathing, hungry. I tried to stand, but my legs were shaking, my body weak from the overwhelming sense of dread. No, I gasped. Please, no, let me go. I don't belong here. The figure that was once me stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with something dark and triumphant. You never belonged anywhere. You're not even real, Sarah. None of this was ever meant for you. The ground trembled, and I felt a deep, gnawing pull in my chest, a tugging, twisting sensation as though something deep within me was being called. The shadows surrounding me began to shift, swirling together into a shape, a figure emerging from the darkness. It was humanoid, towering, and as it stepped forward, the room seemed to warp around it. Its face was obscured, hidden in the swirling blackness, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold, ancient, hungry. And then it spoke. You were the one who was always meant to inherit this. You, Sarah, you are the final piece, the one who was meant to complete the cycle. I tried to scream, to move, but I was frozen in place. My body wouldn't obey. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my vision blurred. The shadowy figure stepped closer, its form expanding, wrapping around me, smothering me in its cold presence. Your family. They were never your family. They were pawns in a game that started long before you were born. Your return was always part of the plan. Your existence, the lie they told you, was the trap. They erased you because they knew what you would become. A cold wind blew through the room, carrying with it a scent of rot and decay. The figure's form seemed to grow larger, swallowing the space around me. I felt the suffocating weight of the darkness closing in, pressing against my chest, my throat, until it felt like I couldn't breathe. And now, the inheritance is complete. Your place has always been here, in the darkness. I gasped as I felt something inside me shift, something deep, something ancient, something that had been hidden for as long as I could remember. A surge of power, dark, cold, and overwhelming, ripped through me, and for a moment, I was filled with an impossible clarity. The voices, the whispers, the pressure, it all made sense. I wasn't meant to run from this place. I wasn't meant to escape. I was meant to take my place. But even as the dark power swirled inside me, I could feel something else, something deeper, a flicker of resistance, a tiny spark of the person I used to be, and for the first time, I realized I had a choice. I wasn't powerless, I wasn't lost. With every ounce of strength I had left, I forced my eyes open, and I spoke. No, I won't be what you want me to be. The room shuddered, and the shadowy figure recoiled, its form twisting as if it were in pain. The voice that spoke from within the darkness cracked and shattered, the sound like breaking glass. You cannot fight it, Sarah. You are already ours. But as I stood, trembling but defiant, I realized that I wasn't just facing this darkness. I was facing the darkest part of myself. And for the first time, I knew that I could either accept my place in this nightmare or I could fight back. The room trembled again, the force of the dark entity recoiling from the resistance I had summoned. I could feel the power, the ancient power that had been buried within me, surging and clashing with the thing that wanted to claim me. The shadow writhed, distorting like a thing alive, its voice low and rumbling with fury. You cannot resist us, Sarah. You are part of the cycle. You are what completes us. I shook my head, the words burning like acid in my ears. No, I'm not your tool. I'm not part of you. The flicker of resistance within me began to grow stronger, like a flame against the wind. I didn't know where this strength came from. Maybe it was a fragment of my true self, buried under years of lies and manipulation. Or maybe it was the realization that I was no longer afraid of the darkness. But something deep inside me surged to the surface, and I finally understood the truth. The truth about my family. The truth about me, the family I had known my whole life, the family that had treated me like a ghost, a non-entity, had not just erased me, they had betrayed me, they had hidden me away, made me a forgotten thing, all to protect themselves from the horrors they had unleashed. But in doing so, they had sealed their own fate. They had allowed this ancient power, this curse, to control them, and now the only way to stop it was for me to face it, to sever the link between the darkness and the family that had trapped it. I stepped forward, my legs trembling but resolute. The shadow recoiled, but I moved closer, summoning every ounce of willpower I had left. "You are nothing," the voice from the darkness spat, its words filled with venom. "We will break you." But I wasn't listening to the voice anymore. I could hear it, yes, but it no longer mattered. I had come to understand that the power it wielded was nothing compared to the strength I had hidden within me, a power born not of darkness, but of defiance, the desire to live, to be seen, to exist. The ground shook beneath my feet, the walls groaning as though the house itself were in pain, resisting the forces at play. I reached out, my hand trembling, but the words formed on my lips with an authority I had never known before. "I release this house. I break the cycle." The room flashed with a violent burst of light. The shadow screeched, its form twisting in agony as though it were being torn apart. The light around me grew blinding, and I felt a surge of heat, of life, flooding into me. The darkness that had consumed my family for generations recoiled, disintegrating into nothingness. The whispers, the voices, the pressure, they all vanished in an instant, replaced by an all-consuming silence. And then I was alone. The house was still, the oppressive weight had lifted. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and dust. The flickering light from the walls faded, and I found myself standing in the center of the stone room, breathing deeply, trying to comprehend what had just happened. It was over. The power that had once controlled my family was gone. The curse had been broken, shattered by my will, and I was free. But even as I tried to gather my thoughts, the questions returned. What had happened to my family? Where were they? Had they been consumed by the curse, lost forever to whatever dark force had taken hold of them? Were they still alive? I stumbled to my feet, my legs shaky from the overwhelming emotions of the moment. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know how much of my family had been lost to the darkness, or how much had been saved. But I had broken the cycle. I had freed myself from the shadow that had hung over me my entire life. I stepped into the hallway, my footsteps echoing through the quiet house. The walls were no longer alive with whispers, no longer watching me with eyes I couldn't see. The house felt empty now, as though the very fabric of it had been hollowed out, drained of the dark presence that had once ruled it. I paused at the door, my hand on the cold metal knob. The wind outside was still. I didn't know where I would go, what I would do, but I knew I couldn't stay in this place any longer. It had been a prison, and now it was just a shell. As I opened the door, I stepped outside into the light of a new day. And for the first time in my life, I felt seen. I don't know how much time passed before I finally left the town. My memories of what happened afterward are blurred, but I do know this. I never went back to the house. I never went back to my family. Sometimes I wonder if they were ever real, or if I was just another part of the illusion, the thing that was never supposed to exist. But then I remind myself that I am real, that I have always been real. And wherever I go from here, I won't ever be forgotten again. The house stood abandoned for years, its windows broken, its doors locked tight. Local legends about the family that lived there and the girl who had disappeared faded into myth. Whispers about the strange happenings that occurred there were passed down, stories told in hushed tones around campfires. But as the years went on, people forgot. Forgotten towns, forgotten people, and in time, even the house was forgotten. But as the seasons changed and the wind howled through the trees, one could still hear the faintest whisper, the softest rustle in the air, as if someone real, was finally free. And if you listen closely enough, you might just hear her voice, faint and distant, echoing across the empty fields. I exist.